Homeless boy's warning leaves billionaire frozen in fear. The Park Cafe was a sanctuary for the city's elite, a place where time seemed to slow, where the scent of fresh espresso mixed with the delicate perfume of blooming flowers. Nestled between meticulously trimmed hedges and the gentle murmur of a nearby fountain, it was the kind of place where problems felt distant, tucked away behind designer sunglasses and perfectly plated meals. At the heart of it all, seated at the cafe's most coveted table, was Bernard Greene. To most, his name was synonymous with power, a billionaire whose presence alone commanded attention. But as he casually lifted his fork, ready to indulge in his meticulously prepared meal, an unexpected voice shattered the cafe's polished tranquility. "Wait!" At each turn, conversations hushed. Waiters froze mid-step. The voice belonged to a boy, dirty, thin, and breathless, standing just beyond the cafe's velvet rope. His clothes hung loosely off his frail frame, his hair unkempt, his wide eyes locked onto Bernard's plate with sheer panic. For a moment, silence gripped the cafe. Then murmurs rose. "A homeless kid? Here? What was he talking about?" Bernard, usually composed, found himself pausing, fork hovering above his plate. Something in the boy's voice, urgent, desperate, made his grip tighten. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone even but laced with curiosity. The boy swallowed hard, chest rising and falling rapidly. Then he pointed to the food. "Sir? Please, just don't eat that." And in that instant, everything changed. A life of grandeur, a moment of pause. Bernard Greene was the embodiment of power and wealth, a self-made titan who'd carved his empire from the unforgiving world of real estate brick by brick. In his 20s, he'd taken risks that others balked at, investing in properties that transformed skylines. By 72, Bernard's ventures spanned industries most couldn't fathom: technology, luxury goods, global markets. His presence was a statement. Sharp suits, tailored to perfection, gold-rimmed glasses that caught the light just right, exuding an air of opulence earned through decades of grit and guile. Walking into any room, Bernard didn't just occupy space, he commanded it. A man who didn't just live in his world, but subtly reminded everyone that he might just own theirs too. Yet today, as he scanned the menu at the Park Cafe, his movements were uncharacteristically slow. The lines around his eyes deepened with contemplation, fingers brushing the fine linen tablecloth, as if grounding himself. Perhaps the years of relentless ambition, of relentless pursuit, were catching up. Across from him sat Marissa, his wife, a vision of youthful beauty, elegance draped in designer fabric, her every gesture as polished as her magazine cover appearance. The sparkle in her eyes mirrored the expensive jewels she wore, yet there was a flicker of concern as she observed her husband's hesitation. The world saw them as the perfect picture of success and glamour, but in this quiet moment, beneath the gaze of the city's elite and the gentle hum of the cafe, there was an undeniable fragility, a crack in the veneer of their gilded world. A picture of elegance, a shadow of hunger. Marissa Greene was the kind of woman who turned heads effortlessly. Her jet-black hair cascaded in sleek waves, framing a face so flawless it looked airbrushed. A striking contrast of red lips against porcelain skin, every detail of her appearance was meticulously curated, an image of luxury and refinement. Yet, beneath the surface, something was missing. Her smile, though practiced, never quite reached her eyes. As she sat across from Bernard, her fingers absently twirled the diamond bracelet on her wrist, the stones catching the afternoon light. But her mind wasn't in the conversation, or even on her husband. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on the glowing screen of her phone, scrolling, reading, escaping. Meanwhile, just beyond the patio fence, another set of eyes observed the cafe's patrons, but for an entirely different reason. A boy lingered in the shadows, small for his age, his frame swallowed by an oversized hoodie that hung from his shoulders like a second skin. His dark eyes darted from table to table, scanning plates piled with food, pockets that might carry spare change. Searching, hunger had sharpened his instincts. He wasn't just looking, he was calculating. And in a world that barely noticed him, he was about to do something that no one at the Park Cafe would ever forget. Opportunity. That was all Malik ever looked for. His name was unknown to the well-dressed patrons of the Park Cafe, but his face was a familiar blur on this street. A kid who was always there, yet never seen. He lived in the spaces between, on the outskirts of conversations, at the edges of concern. People noticed him just long enough to look away. Across the patio, Bernard Green checked his watch, his expression unreadable. "You're distracted again," he remarked, his voice calm but edged with quiet disapproval. Marissa looked up, startled, for half a second, before slipping into the effortless charm that had carried her through so many interactions. She smiled, practiced, polished, but devoid of warmth. "I'm right here," she replied sweetly, reaching across the table to place a delicate hand over his. Her diamond bracelet caught the light as she gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "You know how much I enjoy these lunches." Bernard studied her for a beat longer than usual, but said nothing. Just beyond the patio fence, Malik swallowed hard as his stomach clenched in protest. Hunger had a way of making a person desperate, but desperation had taught him to move carefully. He took a step closer. His footsteps, practiced in the art of silence, barely made a sound. And in that moment, while the city's elite dined without worry, while Bernard measured his wife's words, while Marissa played her part, Malik was about to do something that would make the entire cafe stop in its tracks. A cafe was unknown to the well-dressed patrons of the Park Cafe, but his face was a familiar blur on this street, a kid who was always there, yet never seen. He lived in the spaces between, on the outskirts of conversations, at the edges of concern. People noticed him just long enough to look away. Across the patio, Bernard Green checked his watch, his expression unreadable. "You're distracted again," he remarked, his voice calm but edged with quiet disapproval. Marissa looked up, startled for half a second before slipping into the effortless charm that had carried her through so many interactions. She smiled, practiced, polished, but devoid of warmth. "I'm right here," she replied sweetly, reaching across the table to place a delicate hand over his. Her diamond bracelet caught the light as she gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "You know how much I enjoy these lunches." Bernard studied her for a beat longer than usual, but said nothing. Just beyond the patio fence, Malik swallowed hard as his stomach clenched in protest. Hunger had a way of making a person desperate, but desperation had taught him to move carefully. He took a step closer. His footsteps, practiced in the art of silence, barely made a sound. And in that moment, while the city's elite dined without worry, while Bernard measured his wife's words, while Marissa played her part, Malik was about to do something that would make the entire cafe stop in its tracks. Malik leaned against the patio railing, his dark eyes scanning the tables with quiet precision. Then, they landed on Bernard's meal, a sight that made his stomach twist with longing. A pristine white bowl of soup, still steaming, a side of golden, crusty bread, a chilled glass of sparkling water that caught the afternoon light like a crystal. It was the kind of meal he hadn't seen up close in months, but then something unusual happened. Bernard, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses, reached for his phone. His attention drifted, just for a moment. Marissa, however, did not. Malik's gaze sharpened as her manicured fingers slipped into her designer handbag, moving with a quiet purpose. She wasn't reaching for lipstick, not for a compact mirror. She was reaching for something else, a small vial. His breath hitched as he watched her twist it open with a practiced flick, her movements fluid, deliberate. A barely perceptible tilt of her wrist, and a clear liquid dripped silently into the soup. It blended instantly, vanishing into the rich broth like it had never been there at all. Marissa leaned back, smoothing her napkin over her lap. Her expression didn't change. Her lips curved into the same effortless smile, and just like that, the moment passed. To anyone else, it was nothing. A woman enjoying lunch with her husband, a perfectly ordinary afternoon at the park cafe. But Malik had seen everything, and he knew, this was no accident. The liquid vanished into the broth, disappearing like it had never been there. Malik's breath caught. He stood frozen, his mind racing as he watched Marissa stir the soup with slow, deliberate movements. Her face remained unchanged, poised, elegant, unreadable. Then she leaned in closer to Bernard, her red lips barely moving as she spoke. "After all the trouble I've gone through, you won't ruin this now." Her voice was low but sharp enough to cut through the gentle hum of cafe chatter. Malik blinked, his pulse hammering in his ears. Had he really just seen that? Had he imagined it? Could a woman so effortlessly polished, sitting in a place so pristine, really be doing something so sinister? For a second he hesitated. Maybe he was wrong, maybe it was nothing. But then his gut twisted. Something was very, very wrong. Bernard, unaware, lifted his spoon. Malik's heart pounded against his ribs as he realized if he didn't do something right now, it would be too late. He had to act. Now. And so, with a surge of adrenaline and a voice louder than he'd ever dared to use, he shouted, "Don't eat that!" Malik crouched lower behind the patio railing, his breath shallow. He wasn't sure what he had just witnessed, but something about the woman's voice, those cold, clipped words, sent a shiver through him. His fists clenched, nails pressing into his palms. No one else had noticed. The waiters kept moving, the soft hum of conversation carried on, and the clinking of silverware filled the air. The world hadn't skipped a beat. Only he had. A faint growl in his stomach pulled him momentarily back to reality, a reminder of why he was even there. But hunger took a back seat now. His eyes remained locked on the couple. Bernard looked tired, his sharp exterior softened by something heavier today. His spoon hovered over the bowl, attention split between his meal and his phone, unaware. And Marissa? She was all charm and poise again, her transformation effortless. A bright, practiced smile, a soft laugh that barely touched her eyes, one perfectly manicured hand resting gently on the table, serene, elegant, harmless. But Malik knew better now. His heart pounded as Bernard finally put down his phone, his fingers curled around the spoon, and just as he tilted the bowl toward him, Malik moved. Marissa rested her chin on her hand, the picture of effortless grace. As if she hadn't just whispered something chilling moments ago, Malik could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, heavier than the hunger gnawing at his ribs. Walk away. His instinct screamed it. Keep moving. Keep your head down. This wasn't his world. Who would believe him? A kid in a threadbare hoodie, lingering at the fringes of a cafe where people spent more on a meal than he had seen in months. He swallowed hard, glancing around, laughter, chatter, the clinking of glasses. No one cared. No one even saw him. But Bernard's spoon was dipping into the soup now, the liquid rippling as it neared his lips. Malik's pulse thundered in his ears. This was it. A second more and it would be too late. His body moved before his fear could stop him, and with every ounce of strength in his thin frame, he shouted, "Don't eat that!" Malik's chest tightened. It wasn't just his imagination. He had seen it. The way Marissa's hand had moved, the way the liquid had vanished into the soup. He knew what would happen if the old man took a bite. His thoughts raced. He didn't know Bernard. He didn't know his story, his wealth, his power. But that didn't matter. Right was right. Wrong was wrong. The moment stretched endlessly, tension pressing down on him like a crushing weight. And then, before fear could root him in place, he moved. Pushing off the railing, Malik marched straight to the table. His legs felt like lead, but his feet didn't stop. His breath hitched, his throat burned, but his voice rose above it all, cracking, raw, desperate. "Don't eat that!" Every head turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Somewhere, a fork clattered to the ground. Bernard's spoon froze inches from his lips. And Marissa? She didn't move, didn't blink. But in that split second, Malik saw it, the flicker of something behind her perfect mask. Something cold, something dangerous. And now, all eyes were on him. Malik's voice echoed across the cafe, slicing through the air like a blade. Bernard froze, his spoon suspended inches from his lips, his wide eyes locking onto the boy. Across from him, Marissa's head snapped toward Malik, her expression shifting in an instant. The polished charm drained from her face, replaced by something sharper, colder. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice like cracked ice, sharp enough to cut through glass. Malik didn't flinch. His pulse thundered, his breath ragged, but he stood his ground. His voice was shaky, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "She put something in your food. I saw her. Don't eat it." Gasps rippled through the cafe. A waiter froze mid-step. A woman at a nearby table clutched her napkin to her chest. A man set down his coffee with trembling fingers. All eyes locked onto the scene. The silence that followed was suffocating. Malik's chest heaved, adrenaline coursing through his veins like fire. Bernard's gaze flicked from the boy to his wife, his grip on the spoon tightening, and for the first time since he sat down, he really looked at her. Marissa didn't blink, didn't speak, but in that moment, her perfect mask cracked. Bernard blinked, his sharp mind struggling to process the scene unfolding before him. His gaze darted between the boy, wild-eyed, breathless, unwavering, and his wife, perfect, poised, but suddenly shaken. His fingers trembled as he set the spoon down. "Marissa," he said, his voice calm but heavy, "what is he talking about?" For a heartbeat she didn't move. Then, like a rubber band stretched too thin, her composure snapped. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the stone floor with a piercing screech. "You little liar," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "How dare you accuse me of something so vile? Who even let you in here?" Gasps spread through the cafe. A waiter took an uneasy step back. A woman at a nearby table clutched her pearls, eyes darting between the couple. Malik flinched at the force of her words, but he didn't back down. This wasn't about him. He forced himself to hold Bernard's gaze, his chest heaving, his heartbeat slamming against his ribs. "I saw her," he pleaded, his voice raw. "I know what I saw." Bernard's stare lingered on the boy, but only for a moment. Then, slowly, he turned to his wife. And this time, he really saw her. The tension in her jaw, the flicker of something dark in her eyes, the panic, the guilt, and in that moment, Bernard Green knew. "I saw her," Malik repeated, his voice stronger now, his fear burning away with every word. "She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking." Bernard's expression darkened, his face paling as the weight of the accusation settled over him. Malik took a shaky breath, pushing forward. "If you don't believe me, smell it." A heavy silence followed. Bernard turned toward his wife, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Marissa, what's going on?" His voice was quiet, but the edge in it was unmistakable. Marissa let out a scoff, flipping her hand dismissively. "Oh, please," she sneered. "He's just trying to cause trouble. Look at him. He probably just wants money or food." The words dripped with poison, her tone laced with contempt. She flicked her gaze toward Malik, her lips curling in open disdain. But the boy didn't waver. He didn't shrink under her glare, because he knew the truth, and now so did Bernard. A flicker of doubt crossed the old man's face. His hand hovered over the bowl, hesitation creeping into his features. Marissa's confidence faltered, and in that moment Malik saw it, the thin crack in her perfect mask. She was afraid. Malik didn't waver. He stepped closer to the table, his fists clenched at his sides. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but his voice was steady, unwavering. "I'm not lying." The words hung in the air, stronger than before. "She doesn't want you to know, but I saw everything." Bernard's hand lingered over the bowl, his fingers twitching. His mind warred with itself, caught between disbelief and the slow, creeping doubt curling around his thoughts like smoke. But something in Malik's voice, the raw, desperate certainty in it, made him hesitate. The air around the table thickened, heavy and suffocating. The cafe, once buzzing with life, had fallen into a deep, unnatural silence. Waiters stood frozen in place. Diners sat with forks suspended mid-air, their meals now forgotten. All eyes were on them. Bernard slowly leaned back in his chair, his once calm exterior cracking as he studied the boy in front of him, and for the first time he really saw him. The hunger in his eyes, yes, but beyond that, the truth. Malik had nothing to gain from this. And Marissa? Bernard turned his head slightly, catching the way her fingers curled around the edge of the table, how her breath came quicker now, how her eyes, once sharp with arrogance, had begun to dart. She was no longer looking at him. She was looking for a way out. Bernard's gaze hardened, scrutinizing every inch of the boy before him. His face bore the lines of a man who had spent decades navigating deception. People who wanted something from him, people who played games, people who smiled while sharpening their knives. But this was different. Malik didn't flinch. He didn't fidget, didn't look away, didn't stammer through excuses. He stood his ground. Bernard exhaled slowly, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. "Malik, is it?" The boy nodded. "Yes. I'm telling the truth. Please, don't eat it." His voice was soft but unshakable, and that was what made Bernard hesitate. Marissa let out a harsh, almost mocking laugh, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "This is absurd!" Her tone had sharpened, icier now, defensive. She leveled a glare at Malik, her carefully curated poise cracking at the edges. "He's just some street kid looking for—" She stopped herself, because for the first time, Bernard wasn't looking at Malik anymore. He was looking at her. And the way his expression had shifted from questioning to something far more dangerous made the color drain from her face. "Are you really going to entertain this nonsense, Bernard?" Marissa's voice was sharp now, tinged with something close to desperation. But Bernard didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the spoon again. This time he held it closer to his face, studying the liquid with the careful precision of a man who had spent his life learning when to trust and when to suspect. He revamped the mouth, learning when to trust and when to suspect. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet storm brewing within him. He turned his gaze to his wife, his voice low, deliberate. "Marissa?" The way he said her name made the tension in the cafe snap tighter. His piercing eyes locked onto hers. "You heard him. What exactly is going on here?" Marissa's mask of poise fractured, her lips pressed into a tight line, her nostrils flaring. For a split second, something flashed across her face. Panic, calculation, something dark. And then she let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "I can't believe you're even asking me that." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "It's insulting." Then, as if remembering the watchful eyes surrounding her, she turned to the growing crowd, her voice rising with forced outrage. "He's a liar, a troublemaker. Are you really going to take the word of some filthy street kid over your own wife?" Murmurs spread through the cafe like wildfire. Bernard said nothing. He didn't need to, because the more Marissa spoke, the more he recognized the truth, and the more he realized he had been sleeping next to a snake. "Lying," Marissa spat, her voice shaking with forced conviction. "Look at him. He probably doesn't even know who you are. Why would you trust him over me?" The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. But they didn't have the effect she'd hoped for. The crowd wasn't nodding along, wasn't rallying to her defense. Instead, whispers spread like wildfire through the cafe. Did she really do it? Look at her. She seems nervous. That boy doesn't look like he's making this up. Bernard could feel it, the shift in the room. And so could Marissa. Her eyes darted wildly between the patrons, her polished poise crumbling under their stares. Her breath came quicker, her chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. The murmurs fueled her fury. Her face twisted, the last remnants of charm shattering. And then, bang! She slammed her hands on the table, the silverware clattering against the fine china. The entire cafe jumped. "Enough of this," she snapped, her voice shrill, desperate. Her hands curled into fists, her nails digging into the white linen. "Bernard, eat your damn soup." Silence, the kind that suffocates. Bernard didn't move, didn't even blink. Instead, he reached for the bowl, but not to eat. With one sharp motion, he lifted it and flung the contents onto the ground. The golden liquid splattered across the marble floor, the scent of warm broth instantly tainted by something acrid, chemical. A gasp rippled through the cafe. Bernard slowly turned back to Marissa, and this time he didn't ask. He knew. "Eat the soup and let's go," Marissa hissed, her voice trembling. Not just with rage, but with something deeper, fear. But Malik wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "If you won't believe me, then call someone to test it," he said, his voice rising with urgency. "You're rich. You've got lawyers, doctors, people who can figure it out, but don't eat it. If you do—" He swallowed hard, his chest heaving. "You'll regret it." Bernard's jaw tightened. Slowly he turned back to the bowl. The spoon was still in his hand, hovering just above the surface. But he didn't lift it to his lips. His eyes, tired yet calculating, shifted to his wife. And for the first time he saw her for what she truly was. Not the polished, elegant woman who graced his arm at charity galas. Not the charming, well-spoken socialite who turned heads at every event. But someone who was capable of poisoning his food with a steady hand and a perfectly practiced smile. The silence stretched, thick as fog. And then Bernard made his choice. "Marissa?" Bernard said, his voice low, deliberate. His grip tightened around the spoon, not as an act of trust, but as evidence of betrayal. "You've been acting strange for weeks now. And this?" His words trailed off, heavy with accusation. Marissa's face flushed, her carefully curated facade fracturing. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice lacking its usual composure. Bernard didn't blink. "You can't seriously think I'd poison me," he finished for her, his tone razor sharp. A collective gasp rippled through the cafe. The murmurs grew louder, uncertainty morphing into certainty. "She did it!" "Look at her. She's panicking. That boy saved his life." Malik stood firm. His heart pounded like a drum inside his chest, but he refused to let it show. He had done what he could. Now it was up to Bernard. Marissa's eyes darted around, calculating, searching for an exit, a way out of this moment, this truth. Then slowly she straightened her spine, her face hardening into something cold. The warmth was gone, the charm was gone, and for the first time Bernard saw her exactly as she was. Music. Unfamiliar. The cafe was silent, save for the distant hum of the fountain and the weight of unspoken accusations hanging in the air. Marissa's breath hitched. Then she scoffed. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice straining to sound indignant. "You don't have to sit here and listen to this nonsense." She grabbed her handbag, fingers trembling slightly as she made to stand. But before she could take a single step, Bernard's hand shot out, his fingers wrapped around her wrist. Firm, unyielding, a surprising strength for a man his age. "You're not going anywhere." His voice was calm, but absolute. Not until we get to the bottom of this. A ripple of tension spread through the cafe. The waiter, who had been frozen in place, finally found his voice. "Sir, should I call the police?" The question shattered what little control Marissa had left. For the first time, real panic flickered across her face. Her eyes widened, her breath quickened. She shook her head violently, her voice dropping into something almost desperate. "Don't you dare. This is just a misunderstanding, Bernard. You can't seriously—" But Bernard raised a hand, silencing her mid-sentence. "Yes." His voice was quiet but unshakable. He didn't even look at the waiter when he spoke. His eyes stayed locked on Marissa. "Call them." Malik felt a surge of relief rush through him, but it was fleeting. The truth wasn't fully out yet, and the tension was far from over. The cafe held its collective breath as the waiter hurried inside to make the call. Bernard finally let go of Marissa's wrist. She yanked her arm back, rubbing the skin where his grip had been, not because it hurt, but because for the first time she had lost control. The once effortless charm she wielded with such precision was now unraveling, replaced by something else, something cold, something desperate. Desperation etched itself into Marissa's face. Her lips parted, moving soundlessly, as if grasping for a way out. A story, an excuse, an escape. But there was none, not this time. Meanwhile, Malik stood a few steps back, his hands shaking slightly. He had done everything he could, yet now doubt slithered into his mind like a whisper. What if Bernard didn't believe him after all? What if she twisted the truth just enough to slip away? He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay rooted in place. Then, Malik. Bernard's voice cut through the tension like a blade. The boy looked up, startled. "You said you saw her put something in the soup," Bernard said, his eyes unreadable. "Can you describe it?" Malik swallowed hard, then nodded. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. Malik stepped forward quickly, his voice urgent. "It was a small bottle, like one you'd use for medicine, clear liquid. She poured it in when you were looking at your phone, then stirred it. I swear I saw it." Bernard's face tightened, his jaw clenching. Slowly he turned to Marissa. She was already shaking her head, her voice rising in desperation. "This is absurd. He's lying. Why would he lie?" Bernard's voice cut through her protests like steel. His eyes bore into her, cold and calculating. What could he possibly gain from this? A murmur spread through the cafe. And then, the distant wail of sirens pierced the air. Marissa stiffened. Her eyes darted, just for a split second, toward the soup. And in that single moment, her carefully constructed mask shattered. Marissa's crafted facade slipped completely. Her polished charm crumbled, leaving behind nothing but a woman who was cornered. And then, grasping at anything to regain control, she rounded on Malik. "You've been spying on us, haven't you?" Her voice was sharp, brittle. "Trying to cause trouble because you're jealous of people who actually have something." The words hit Malik like a slap. Harsh, cruel, meant to break him. But he didn't flinch. He stood his ground. "I'm not jealous." His voice was steady, unwavering. "I saw what I saw, and I couldn't just stand there and let you hurt him." The cafe held its breath, and then the sirens grew louder. The weight of the moment crashed down as the doors swung open. 2 police officers strode inside, their gazes sharp, their hands resting lightly on their belts. The room seemed to shrink as they approached the table. All eyes were on Marissa. There was nowhere left to run. One of the officers stepped forward, his hand still resting on his belt. "What's going on here?" His tone was neutral but authoritative, the kind that expected answers. Bernard rose slowly from his chair, his towering frame still commanding respect despite his age. "Officers, I need you to take a look at this." He gestured toward the bowl of soup. "This boy claims my wife poisoned it." A hush fell over the cafe. The officers exchanged quick glances, their expressions carefully blank. One of them leaned down, sniffing the bowl cautiously, his brow furrowed slightly. Then he turned to Marissa. "Ma'am, do you have anything to say about this?" All eyes were on her. Her face flushed crimson, her fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag. And then her voice cut through the air, sharp and defensive. "This is ridiculous. He's just a street kid." Marissa's voice rose in desperation. "Bernard, you're really going to let this nonsense go this far? He's just a street kid trying to make trouble." But the officer wasn't buying it. His expression remained firm, unreadable. "We need to test the contents." He reached for the bowl. "No!" The word tore from Marissa's throat, sharper than she meant. Too sharp. A few gasps rippled through the cafe. Her outburst had drawn even more attention. The officer paused, his gaze hardening. "Ma'am, is there something you'd like to tell us before we proceed?" The silence was suffocating. Marissa hesitated, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her eyes flickered between Bernard, the officers, and the bowl. Her hands clenched at her sides. She was cornered, and she knew it. Marissa's fingers trembled as they clenched around her handbag. The pressure was too much. Her mask, her composure, shattered. And then she snapped. "Fine!" she spat, her voice low but dripping with venom. "You want the truth? I'm tired of living in his shadow. Tired of his control over everything." Her chest heaved, her anger boiling over. "He was never supposed to make it past this year, and She froze. The realization hit too late. She had said too much. The cafe erupted, gasps, whispers. Some patrons pulled out their phones, recording the moment. Bernard's face drained of color, his expression unreadable. But his eyes held something darker. The weight of her confession hit him like a truck. One of the officers stepped forward, his presence looming. "Ma'am, place your bag on the table. Now." The officer's voice was grim. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for attempted murder. Hands where I can see them." Marissa's composure collapsed. She screamed, thrashing as they locked her hands behind her back. "You don't understand. I deserved everything he had. Everything!" Her voice echoed through the stunned cafe. Bernard sat heavily in his chair, his fingers trembling as he pushed the soup away. For a long moment he said nothing. His face was a storm of disbelief, betrayal, quiet fascination. Bernard exhaled, long and slow, before turning back to Malik. The boy stood frozen, uncertain, as if waiting for someone to tell him what came next. But then, Bernard's gaze softened. The storm in his eyes settled, replaced by something quieter, a flicker of gratitude. Malik hadn't just saved his life, he had exposed a truth Bernard never would have seen coming. Around them the cafe buzzed back to life in hushed murmurs. Patrons exchanged wide-eyed glances, still reeling from what they had witnessed. Some looked at Bernard with pity, others with awe, the frayed edges of his hoodie. "You don't have to," he mumbled, eyes flickering downward, but Bernard shook his head. "No, you didn't have to step in, but you did." Malik swallowed hard. The tension in his shoulders refused to ease. The cafe had returned to its rhythm, but every so often someone stole a glance at their table, curiosity still thick in the air. Bernard studied the boy, seeing him clearly for the first time. "When was the last time you had a real meal?" he asked. Malik hesitated. "Too long." Bernard didn't wait for an answer. He signaled for a waiter. "Bring him whatever he wants." Malik's eyes widened, but Bernard simply nodded. "Sit, eat, then we'll talk." Not just as a street kid lingering on the edges of society, but as someone real, someone with a heart that refused to turn cold. Bernard exhaled slowly, then nodded. "That matters, Malik. More than you know." The boy shifted uncomfortably, unused to being the center of attention, especially for something good. The waiter arrived, setting down a plate piled high with food. Malik stared at it, his fingers twitching like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to reach for it. Bernard gave him a small nod. "Go on." For the first time that day, Malik let himself breathe. As he picked up the fork, Bernard leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "You don't like seeing people get hurt," he echoed. "Neither do I." A pause. "Maybe it's time I stop looking the other way too," Bernard returned. His expression had softened. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and sat down, folding his hands on the table. "You're not in trouble, Malik." His voice was steady, reassuring. "I just made a call to someone who can help." Malik's fingers curled around the edge of his chair. "Help?" he echoed, skepticism woven into the word. Bernard nodded. "A friend of mine runs a program for kids like you, a safe place, a fresh start." Malik's throat tightened. He wanted to believe it, but the world had taught him that kindness usually came with a price. Will asked hesitantly. "Why would you do that for me?" Bernard leaned forward, his sharp businessman's gaze replaced by something almost fatherly. "Because today, you saved my life." He paused. "Let me return the favor." For the first time in a long time, Malik felt something unfamiliar. Hope. "More people like you, it would be a much better place." Malik swallowed hard, his instincts telling him to refuse, to run before this kindness turned into something else. But there was no trick in Bernard's eyes. Just sincerity, gratitude. "I don't know," Malik mumbled, shifting in his seat. Bernard leaned back, giving the boy space to breathe. "No pressure," he said. "But think about it. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Malik had spent so long looking out for himself, surviving one day at a time. The idea of someone actually wanting to help, without expecting anything in return, felt foreign. For the first time in years, he let himself consider the possibility of something better. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment his life changed forever. Eyes searching Bernard's face, looking for the catch. The moment this turned into another disappointment. But there was nothing but sincerity in the old man's expression. Malik hesitated, his fingers gripping the fabric of his worn-out hoodie. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Bernard offered a small, understanding smile. "You don't have to know. You just have to take the first step." The boy exhaled, his chest loosening ever so slightly. For years, survival had been his only goal. Now, for the first time, someone was offering him something more. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to accept it. For what's right, even when no one else will. Bernard watched the boy, seeing not just the struggle in his eyes, but the fire too. "Come on, Malik," he said, standing up and placing a firm but gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Malik hesitated for only a second before nodding. As they stepped away from the table, the whispers in the cafe faded into the background. For the first time in a long time, Malik wasn't just a boy on the outskirts. He was stepping towards something new, something better, for what's right, no matter the odds. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for more tales of courage, truth, and redemption. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that even the smallest actions can create life-changing impacts. And as always, stay bold, stay kind, and never be afraid to stand up for what's right.